Hello, I'm Nick Feldman. I'm a tutor and course developer at Point Blank Music School's campus in London. And today we're going to look at a couple of products from Plugin Boutique. Now, veterans of the sample library world, Loopmasters have recently broadened their horizons into the software market, as well as the introduction of their Loop Cloud service, which has recently just hit 2.0. They also run the Plugin Boutique, a virtual storefront where various companies sell their wares, and the team themselves have created several instruments and effects as well. And we're going to look at two of those. One is Big Kick, our kick drum synthesizer on the right there, and Carbon Electra, which is a synthesizer. Now, these products obviously sit amongst a crowded market with synth samplers and effects coming from every conceivable angle. And the focus of Plugin Boutique with these products, particularly these two we're going to look at, seem to be taking all the trimming the fat and taking off the bloated designs, just leave the essentials, which means you can program sounds quickly and easily. Now, that doesn't mean it might not appeal to advanced sound designers and tweakers, but there is a lot to be said for these kind of clean, very usable GUIs, and they both sound great. I mean, that's the most important thing at the end of the day. So I really think they've hit the nail on the head with these two products, because they're kind of modern without being too flashy, but both have enough tricks and neat little features to make them desirable to use. Okay, so we're going to start off looking at Big Kick first, and the idea behind this is just a quick, easy but tweakable way to create the perfect kick drum. Now, if you were to have a look at a selection of electronic kick samples or classic kick drum sounds, you'd find that they're kind of made of two constituent parts, or at least a successful kick drum is. So you've got the bass tone, the thud, the all-important kind of bass aspect to it, but there's also an attack section. There's usually an upper presence, a click of some kind, something that actually lets the kick cut through the mix. And that's essentially what you get here with Big Kick. You get this bottom part here, which is the body. This is the actual drum synth part, and this is there to actually shape and sculpt the actual tone. It's tunable. You can tune it by frequency. You can choose it by note, which is currently set to at the moment, and it's got various controls for controlling the rapid pitch drop, which is characteristic of a kick drum. In fact, if you want to synthesize any kind of drum sound or percussive sound, the use of a kind of quickly decaying pitch envelope will get you most of the way there, and it gives you the thwack on the front of a drum sound. But as I said, that's not good enough on its own. It sounds very flat, and so what you then get is up to 2 samples from a large bank of samples that you can load, which then give you that character and the kind of upper frequency content that lets your kick drum actually have true presence and not just that sort of bass thud. So yes, there's a number of different settings. Let's just run through a little bit of some of those settings. This one's been tweaked, but what I was going to do is to strip it back a little bit so that we can kind of build up to the kind of sound that's there at the moment. As with most of this, of course, the important part for the track, for getting it working in your piece of music, is going to be the body section. So the body part here, if we play this now, there's a little loop going on. So the body part here has a number of controls for the overall amp of it, so we can roll off the attack a little bit should we need to. We also have essentially a hold, which gives us a bit more of a sustained boom to the kick drum, and we've got the all-important decay. And it's quite important because a lot of people when starting out might actually end up having some very flabby kick drums where it kind of gets quite messy and things are overlapping, and so it might be tempting to have a big boomy long decay on the kick sound, but actually you'll find it doesn't really work overall when playing against other sounds. So if we can just bring in another little kind of clap to put this into context, and I say it sounds great with a long decay, but actually we get a little bit more groove, and it will definitely clean up the mix if we don't go too crazy with that, even though I'm going for something of a kind of bass heavy kind of style for this. Okay, let's stop that clip. Then underneath that, as I said, we've got controls that control the curve and the the decay of the pitch aspect of a kick drum. So here we can quickly shift it to a deep, low sounding kick. We can also give it that kind of slightly lasery pinch at the start there, which obviously is a bit more useful for certain types of genres than others. If you really like that kind of lasery, harder kind of style, in fact you can actually change the mode here of the body from the original, which they sort of suggest is perhaps better for kind of house and more kind of pop sort of styles of music, but then you have the tough mode, which gives you that kind of sharp, lasery start to the kick, which again isn't for everyone, but works really well for certain types of music. We also have the time, as I said, it takes to decay and change that rapid descension from the high frequency part. Now you can see that in the waveform here. We start with a much higher frequency that gives us that kind of attack transient, even though we haven't quite got onto that stage yet, and then it kind of bottoms out to your actual tone that you have. Now, as I said, you can, if you like, adjust this as a frequency. Now, if you're not into tune kick drums, this would be a welcome way to do it, and of course it means you might be able to fit and slot into a certain frequency range in your music that could do with being filled up with a kick drum. If, however, and I'm not always falling into the tune kick drum kind of mode of working, but I thought I'd give that a go with this product. If you want to tune your kick drum, for instance, to the root note of your track, and mine happens to be in the key of B, then you can switch that and it will automatically find the fundamental frequency of B1 in this case. There are some other things we can do right here, like I actually had this on one shot, which means that here where we have shorter notes, they would actually play all the way through. Now if I take that off, you can hear that actually it's cutting those, and that's part of what I actually wanted to do for this track. And it gives me a little variance as we play those shorter notes in the clip. As I said, one shot effectively removes that, so any length of incoming MIDI note would actually trigger the sound across its full length. So I'll just undo that one again. So this then brings us to adding the character using our samples. And so say Big Kick has chosen to do that with samples. It could also be achieved with more synthesis. FM synthesis has been quite good, and we sometimes look at that in classes when we're on a sound design module at the school, and we can do that in a number of different ways. One very simple and straightforward way though is to add samples. In this case we can add a sample in the first slot there, which we have a few basic controls for: an overall gain, decay, and of course skipping through the different samples. And even on these samples, if I was to solo it, you can hear it isn't very much at all on its own, but somehow really works in the context of a kick drum with that body and bass tone present. We can also add a second sample. So here I found something else that's a little bit different. It's not just the sort of standard sample, and again could give the sound overall a little bit of character. And I've turned that down a little bit so it's not quite as prevalent as the first one. So you'd think that'd be it. That's kind of enough to get a decent enough kick drum sound going. I might have lost my way a little bit, so I can always come back to the file menu here and load the preset that I'd made earlier, where I'd actually fine-tuned all this. But there is a little bit more. We can go to the edit menu, and there you can see that there is actually an equalizer, and I've just scooped out a tiny bit of mids on there, brought up a bit of the highs, which of course we could do the opposite if you prefer, and also just giving it a little bit of extra punch and welly. And just close that menu there. We also have, if we hit the wave button there, some extra overdrive and distortion. Now this is obviously also another good method of being able to bring some harmonic content into your kick sound, and this can also help bring it up out of the depths and make it ring through and cut through any of your other drums or other track elements. Here, because of this is quite a heavy sort of sound, I didn't really need to bring it very much. I've given it this, oh no, actually I've turned it down, so let's bring that back in. Just a very slight amount of the clipper. There are a few different modes here. Obviously some will kind of siphon out some of the bass from there. So I'm just going to use the tiniest amounts of overdrive there just to round off this sound. And as I said, of course, this will make a bit more sense when we put it into context in the next part when we actually look at our Carbon Electra synth product. So that brings us on to Carbon Electra. This is primarily a subtractive synth, but it also features oscillator sync mode, some ability to apply frequency modulation to one of the oscillators, and also a pitchable noise oscillator, which you don't see everywhere, plus 3 routable LFOs, a slew of effects there, including distortions, chorus delay, phaser, and a nice simple but effective EQ unit. But it has a few tricks up its sleeve, as well as the main thing that I think it's got going for it, which is great sound quality. Flicking through the presets initially, everything sounds big and bold, and quite straightforward, and it just feels like it's going to sit really well in the mix. I started off by using a couple of the presets to kind of add to what I'd already started with, the kind of drum parts here involving big kick as well. But I'll just quickly run through what we're seeing here before we actually sort of dive into how we might actually make some sounds. So straight away, what you can see here is there are 4 oscillators in total. We've got coarse tuning, fine tuning. We can change the waveform there from pulse width to saw to triangle, sine, and as I said, a sample and hold variant of noise, meaning it's pitchable. And then, as I said, you might be forgiven for thinking that's just a very simple, straightforward subtractive setup, but actually we can add some FM to the first oscillator. Now that modulating operator, oscillator, however you want to call it, they're usually called operators in FM, is actually pitched 2 octaves underneath our incoming note. So that gives it quite a warm and rich kind of feel to it, which you don't always get with FM. It can be quite quite harsh and top heavy. We also can actually apply hard sync. Now this will be where one oscillator, in this case the second oscillator, would slave to the first, and each cycle of that would re-trigger the second one. Now that results in quite a screaming kind of sound, which we'll explore in a bit. But that again gives it a little bit of it's one of the little tricks in its arsenal. And then we move on to the envelope stage. Now this is quite simple, which suggests, of course, it's perhaps a little bit better suited for simpler sounds, leads and basses and so forth, because we've got an amp envelope and a single modulation envelope, which can be applied in various parts and places around the interface. Then we've got our mixer, so the 4 oscillators and an additional noise oscillator, and our filter section, where, as you can imagine, we see the classics: low pass, band pass, high pass, band reject, but also a vocal formant style filter as well. And obviously vocal kind of effects have been the rage for quite some time now. There are 3 independent LFOs, though they do tend to have, each one has a sort of its chosen set of destinations that it wants to go to. And these can be made to play in sync. There's a number of different waveform options, and they can also be played as kind of poly or mono sort of style LFOs. Over here in the bottom right hand corner, we see the global master section settings, and there we find stuff to do with polyphony, glide time, unison, so we can add up to 4 voices and detune them and pan those out a little bit. and obviously that gives us a nice thick kind of ensemble chorus kind of sound. We can change the pitch bend range. It starts off at a modest 2 semitones that can actually go up to 2 octaves either way if you want that, and that will let you do a little bit more extreme kind of pitch sort of style bending and effects in your MIDI parts. And then there's this. Now this you will have also seen perhaps a sort of variant in other products, but this gives us a step envelope which allows us to create a little step sequence for modulation, which we can also assign to pitch, so that can also become a kind of step sequencer, and we'll look at that as a separate kind of aspect in a moment. And that's where we can assign that to various things and other parts of the synth. So loading presets is as simple as going up here. There's a bunch of factory stuff. You see I just pulled out a bass preset for this. We've also got a presets that are have been created by artists, and were we to have any, we would find any expansion packs that you've loaded in there as well. Okay, so yeah, getting started. We've just taken a couple of the presets out of here to kind of load them into our existing track. And these didn't really require very much processing for me to be able to fit them into the groove. I'm also using actually in this a couple of loops extracted from the Loop Cloud service. So that's also from, as I said, the Loop Masters Camp, and that's a new service where you can through a separate app, browse their extensive sample library and only download the ones that actually work with your music. So you can play them in sync and then download them. So these two have been processed by the Loop Cloud app and then dropped in here, and they're just providing a little bit of extra movement to the whole thing. Okay. So that's already well and good, but obviously most people don't buy a synth to just load the presets. So let's look at how we can actually tweak this. So let's just solo this one for a second. Okay, so at the moment it's a very simple sound. It's just a pulse width running at a fairly even width, giving us a fairly straightforward square wave type sound. And I'm not really making any use of the filter, any of the LFO section. And also in this sound, I'm actually going to use quite a few of the effects. Some of the other features we'll look at in another sound that I've made from basic, initialized preset for this synth. The first thing, as I said, we can do is to actually apply this FM dial. And so that's 2 octaves down, and we get a nice set of buzzy kind of harmonics that we would expect to get from FM synthesis. At the moment, our envelope is just on full sustain, which again isn't particularly interesting. And for this kind of chord sound, we could probably do dropping that down. So let's bring that down and focus on just adjusting that decay sound. And then of course we can bring down the filter. And it's a nice thick sounding filter. We don't have a lot of options. We don't get to choose the slope. However, I say it's nicely modelled, and actually once we choose our kind of low point, which of course is the start and end of an envelope where the actual cutoff is set, we can then bring up that modulation envelope, and that will then apply this envelope here to the filter cutoff. Now you can see here I've actually got a bit of a tack, so I'm going to take that out a little bit. So we reset that back to kind of starting with the actual sound itself. And by saying it like that, we kind of just roll off some of those higher frequencies, but still have enough coming through in the attack phase, in the attack section of our sound to kind of keep it bright, keep it interesting. So then if we move to the effects, we've got a chorus. It's very reminiscent of some of the old classic synth chorus units that you might know. And we also have a delay. So I've set this up already. So I'm cutting a little bit of the lows and the highs and just adjusting that. We've got 3 different modes we can use for that. I'm just in the cross mode at the moment. We have a phaser, which obviously again has kind of scooped out the sound a little bit. Now it works quite well for this particular sound, especially after the delay's been applied. But obviously again wouldn't work for some certain lead sounds that you want to keep nice and solid. And we've got the distortion unit, which I'm using just ever so slightly because it's not really that kind of sound. That would work better again on basses and more upfront and slightly aggressive kind of leads. And then we've got an equalizer. So our equalizer here is just a simple bass control, and then we've got kind of sweepable mid-range and a kind of adjustable high shelf as well. And so there you go, we've taken our fairly simple and straightforward sort of chord riff and added a bunch of other aspects to it to make it come to life. One thing I didn't mention there, so let's just quickly apply that, is we have the LFO section. Now, depending on what it is I want to actually apply the LFO to, I would need to actually go and use the relevant number out of the 3. Now, I was thinking just to try out applying an LFO to the amp stage here, so I am actually going to turn this back on, turn up the amount. I would usually just turn up to maximum until I've actually got the desired settings, the speed and so forth. Stick that onto pulse and stick it onto sync mode. So this is now slaving to divisions of my tempo, and we're running this on the 16th. Yep. As you can see, that's now then applying it to the amp. If I wanted to lessen that a little bit, we could then always bring that down a little bit. For this next sound, I thought I'd go on a little bit of a tangent and explore more of a techno-orientated sound, and that would make use of some of the other features that we find in Carbon Electra. So the main thing that's actually making this work down here is this step envelope. Now, as I said, this step envelope can then be applied to a number of different things, and at the moment there's quite a bit going on already. But as you see me actually play with the steps here, we will start to hear a pronounced change in the sound as we kind of do that. So you might recognize this from sort of things like the Performer in Massive and so on. And what it is it allows us to kind of almost do a kind of an automation step for each step of this. Now, it is generally slave to the grid and plays in sync, though you can change that a little bit. And we get to choose a bunch of different shapes to be applied to them. So at the moment, I just worked with the basic ramp that was there when I started, but actually then I started to find there was much more interesting shapes to play with available. So coming back to the source of the sound, the oscillator here has a little bit of FM applied to it, but the main thing here is that I'm using the hard sync mode. So this means that oscillator 2 is slaving to oscillator 1. Every sort of new phase of this is then re-triggering this oscillator, which usually leads to quite a screaming kind of effect. Now, in order to, I can actually hear both oscillators at the same time, but in order to hear this on its and the effect that it's having, I don't actually need oscillator 1. So in the mixer, I've turned down oscillator 1, and I'm just listening to oscillator 2. And apart from that, what we're doing with this to be able to give us this kind of slightly off-key riff is it's actually affecting the note pitch. I've also applied some glide to that, so there's a bit more bend again between each note. It's also I'm also applying the same set of modulation to the cutoff. As you can see, actually, the filter cutoff is going a little bit crazy here. But without it, it's not really working. And again, obviously this is quite a strange sound. To put it in context, we hear, of course, all those anchor points of the kick and clap that actually starts to make a little bit more sense. This is perhaps not everyone's cup of tea. So what we've got here is just a low pass. I'm also using the the modulation envelope. Now, kind of techno sounds like this really do, as you can hear, rely on having a great deal of automation to essentially create the kind of funk and groove, the machine funk, let's call it, that's inherent in this. But the main thing that I wanted to explore here, and what we can also do, I believe, is I think the sound also worked quite well with some distortion and the equalizer. Again, just running off a little bit of bass and taking out some mids and just scooping that sound out a little bit. But now we've got that rolling, adjustments to oscillator 1 are having quite a pronounced effect on oscillator 2 with this hard sync mode. And here again, by adjusting that pitch, perhaps if I just come and stop this for a second and play, we can actually hear the effect of the hard sync oscillator a little bit clearer. So let's just have a look at this step envelope, because as I say, this is one of the little nifty little features that I enjoyed in Carbon Electra. I started to play around with it here, and I thought I'd leave the rest of it for this video. And again, what we might want to do here is to play this in context, but let's just start off by adjusting this. So we can choose the wave for each step here. At the moment, I've chosen to limit this to 8 of a possible 16. I find unless you actually need a full 16, a lot of these kind of step sequencing pattern sort of based things like this are much better in shorter ones. If you're also trying to do like a galloping kind of arpeggiated sound almost, then again, shorter ones work better for that. And so, yeah, it makes it easier to program, of course. So here we've got a bunch of other shapes. So let's keep this running, and then we can play around with this a little bit. This may start to deteriorate. I might lose my way, of course. This can be quite a fiddly process. Let's change from a sine wave and apply that. What other ones have we got here? We've got these. As you can see, it's kind of lots and lots of variations and things you can do, and of course you could then start to play around with what that is applied to as well. So all in all, I would say that Carbon Electra is a nice straightforward synth that everything's on screen. There's no kind of losing stuff in behind panels and pages, so it's nice and quick and easy to dial up sounds. You could argue it's a little bit limited in its scope, but then if you've got good sound quality on your side and a few kind of, say, simple but effective features that really bring the sounds to life, then it still has a rightful place in anyone's instrument collection. Same goes for Big Kick. I would argue again that it just does exactly what it needs to do through its kind of clever usage of the samples to provide the character and the top end, and a nice simple set of controls with a few options to change and tweak it as you go to be able to control the bass tone of it. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. We have a number of modules at Point Blank Music School, both at our various campuses and online, that can guide you through the production and sound design process. So whether you're an absolute beginner or just looking to firm up some existing skills, why not check out our website at pointblankmusicschool.com and see what we have to offer. See you next time.